As I speak, no one has claimed responsibility for the ghastly, murderous suicide bombing in Istanbul, in which 6 people at least have died and scores have been maimed, wounded and injured. By a suicide bomber, one presumes to be associated with the ISIS Al-Qaeda alphabet soup, which has been doing Western bidding in Syria for so many years now. Of course, there is the possibility that another outfit carried it out. It's not clear yet. But I'm working on the hypothesis that Erdogan is a very unpopular man in NATO. He has set up a hub for the distribution worldwide of Russian oil and gas. He is refusing to implement economic sanctions against Russia. Only yesterday he complained that Western leaders in the run-up to the G20 meeting speak, think, dream of nothing except punishing Russia, when what was needed was the kind of negotiating efforts that he has been trying to launch on the food corridor over the Sebastopol attack. Russia froze its involvement in allowing Ukrainian grain out through Sebastopol onto the international market. Erdogan was pushing and partially succeeded so far in reopening that corridor. He has been seeking to use the G20 coming up in Bali as a launchpad for proper negotiations. Is Turkey being punished for its failure to allow Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance? Both of their governments announced their wish to, but that requires unanimity on the NATO Governing Council. Turkey has therefore effectively a veto, and it has publicly declared that it will exercise that veto and scupper the enlargement of the alliance still further, because that provocation could beget even more wars across the very narrow waterway into Finland and the bigger waterway into Sweden. Who knows? This is speculation on my part. But I have watched the riots being activated in Iran. I've watched riots being activated in Saudi Arabia. I've watched Imran Khan being shot. I've watched as one after another of those either left, never were in, or were thinking of leaving the US envelope come to harm on the streets of their country. And therefore, I'm treating, until otherwise persuaded by evidence, this attack on Turkey as a NATO-inspired attack. And I have watched now for well over a decade the NATO-inspired maneuvers which have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria. And I smell a rat, a NATO rat, on the streets of Istanbul. All the more remarkable given that Turkey has been from the very beginning a member of the very NATO which may now be attacking it. I mentioned earlier the bigger bombshell, not that it has yet killed more than 6 people, though it is likely that there'll be way more than 6 suicides as a result of the collapse, having been robbed of billions of dollars of the FTX conglomerate Ponzi scheme, posing as a Bitcoin provider. It wasn't actually providing Bitcoins, it was providing an IOU to very large numbers of customers and very large customers, customers of some importance, like the government of the Ukraine, for example. How's that for a Ponzi scheme? The United States taxpayer is forced to give billions of dollars to the government in Ukraine, which uses some of it to buy IOUs for Bitcoin from a company called FTX, which in turn donates well over $40 million to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. A loop which could bring Joe Biden down. If the Republicans, as one presumes when the counting finally stops, take control of the House of Representatives, they have the power to launch inquiries. I had thought it would be the Hunter Biden laptop inquiry that would be the first cab off the rank, but this one beats it by a very large, exponentially large margin. Because if corruption in which the Democratic Party can be found to be implicated, this FTX company was the second biggest donor to the Democratic Party in this election season. Guess who the first donor was? You guessed it, George Soros. George Soros, number one, FTX, number two. Now, many of us have been charting the doings of George Soros for a very long time, including his looting of the property of Jews in Hungary, because he said, if I hadn't stolen it, someone else would have. A rubric which might well inform the rest of his financial and political career. He gave over $100 million to Joe Biden in this election season. He also funded sundry NGOs that were effectively tools of the Democratic Party. Organizations like Mind the Gap, run by the mother of the young man who owned FTX and had nobody on his board except his lawyer and a former FTX employee. A rat, you think, might well have been smelt in the FTX affair. But actually, this man had open access to the White House and publicly pledged $100 million. Perhaps he was in an auction with George Soros as to who could be the man responsible for the biggest donations in the next presidential elections. He openly stated this donation was in the pipeline, even though he must have known that his Ponzi scheme risked collapse the moment that donors asked for their bitcoins rather than the IOU, which of course happened immediately. He was forced to reveal that his company had been hacked and $400 million of investors' money stolen. Now, they were all in bed with this young man. The football industry, the baseball industry, the basketball industry, CNN, and many others were up to their neck in involvement with this young man who has now cost billions of dollars in losses and is now shanghaied in the Bahamas, where financial criminals are usually allowed to escape, but this young man will definitely not be allowed to escape. He will come back in handcuffs for the full perp walk. But what happens when he goes on trial? What happens when the House of Representatives gets to work on him and his connections to the Democratic Party? I apologize for being incompletely briefed on this story. It literally happened in the hour before I came on the air and when I was otherwise engaged. But I'll be dealing with it in some depth on Wednesday on the midweek MOATS, I can promise you. And so will the rest of the world's media. I can say to you for now, this may be the biggest financial, political scandal in all human history. It may destroy the cryptocurrency industry. It may lead to further collapses as other crypto companies are beginning to announce the levels of their exposure in the collapse of FTX. It's going to be a big one. Stay tuned to the mother of all talk shows about it. Now, the third world election, I said on Wednesday, I had been a monitor, even a chief monitor, at many elections in many so-called third world countries, from Mozambique to Pakistan, from South Africa to Zimbabwe to Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, like the Phnom Penh residency I had for 4 weeks, in which I was the chief European election monitor. I have fond memories of it. Every single one of those elections was run far better than the US midterm elections. Missing ballot papers turning up in the dead of the night, printers in polling places running out of ink at 9 a.m. in the morning when they were facing a whole day of voting, computers misfiring, voting machines not working, courts turning down extension proposals for 3 hours in the case of Arizona, when the voters had lost 3 hours through the aforementioned broken down printing machines in Maricopa County, which contains the great city of Phoenix, Arizona. The voting delays always result in Democratic Party victories. Have you noticed that? It may be, of course, a coincidence, but in more than 80% of the cases that I have tracked, extensive delays in the recording of results has finished with a Democratic Party victory. Again, I smell a rat. In Phoenix, in Nevada, in many other places across the United States, I smell a rat. Now, the Republican Party are no Spartacus. A party run by the leaders of the Republicans in the Senate and the House are not a party with which I can associate myself. They are as bad as the other cheek of the US corporate democratic backside. But I am in favor of justice, no matter who it's for, no matter who it's against. I am against fraudulent elections, no matter who's conducting them, no matter who is inconvenienced as a result. And therefore, I say that if the American people accept this, they are accepting their good night as one of the world's big, great democracies, one of the great countries of the world. Because if you can't get your voting right, what's the point of voting? If you cannot trust that the people sitting in your government have the right to be there, then what's the point of having a democracy? As President Francis Urquhart said in House of Cards, looking off camera, democracy, it's so overrated. Well, American democracy certainly is overrated. But when all is said and done, the Republicans now control the House of Representatives, albeit narrowly. They have the right, as I said, to conduct inquiries. And boy, will they conduct inquiries. They have the right to stop Joe Biden's budgets from passing. And boy, will they. They have the right to stop Joe Biden's legislative program of action, though that will not be as momentous as he doesn't have a legislative program for action. But I want to extend a thesis that may very well be one you hadn't thought of. This election is bad for the Democrats, not least because it guarantees that Joe Biden will be the presidential candidate in 2024. If this had been a bad night for the Democrats in that they had lost the Senate as well, then the clamor for the replacement, not just of Nancy Pelosi, which is well underway, but the clamor for the replacement of Joe Biden as president would have grown and perhaps become unstoppable. but they can't and won't do it now. So in 24, when Joe Biden's mental acuity will be just as sharp as it is now, although it might decline a little. 2 years is a long time in politics when you're 93 or whatever it is he is. He will be their nominee. He's untouchable now. The question, therefore, is who he's going to face. Well, we'll know more about that this week, when in Mar-a-Lago, this week, Donald Trump will announce whether or not he's running. Now, his formerly best friend, Piers Morgan, has just tweeted that this is going to be a very busy news night. He put all news organizations on notice alongside a clock saying tick-tock. I don't know to what he refers. Maybe Mr. Murdoch has fired him. Maybe Mr. Murdoch is closing the ill-fated Talk TV down. Or maybe he knows something about Donald Trump's intentions. We'll see in the course of the next 2 hours, and you'll get it here. If not first, then as fast as you'll get it anywhere else. That I promise. I've only got a minute or two to tee up our next guest, but that's as it should be. Because our next guest, Gonzalo Lira, an American in Ukraine, is, along with other experts on the subject there, our most popular guest by far. Gonzalo Lira knows everything that's happening in Ukraine, not least because he's there. But Russia has withdrawn in good order, blowing the bridges behind them to the Dnipro. Regular viewers will know that I have predicted from the beginning of this war, this special military operation, which is more properly described as a war, that the Dnipro will be the border between Russia, Novorussia, and the Ukraine, the Western Ukrainian statelet, which will be, like Kosovo, a NATO protectorate, dependent forever on you, the taxpayers of the European Union and North America. And it may be that Russia withdrew from Kherson on the west bank of the Dnipro to prefigure what will be a final negotiated settlement of this war, with the Dnipro as the border between the two countries. As it happens, I don't think so. Not least because Russia is still fiercely at war to the south and in other parts of the Donbass where there are pockets of Ukrainian military resistance. And not least because without guarantees that the Western Ukrainian statelet would not be a permanent thorn in the side of Russia and a perpetual candidate for membership of NATO, with all that that entails, with the sighting of American nuclear missiles in the western part of Ukraine, I don't see that that would satisfy Russia's war aims.